After the turn of the 20th century, the Canadians wanted their own rifle, and that gun was invented by Sir Charles Ross. It was a unique straight pull that was very accurate, used in the Olympics, but sadly, it turned out to be a pretty poor combat rifle.
The Mark III Ross rifle is one of the guns in the inventory of World War I standard long arms that you'll want to collect if, in fact, you want to build a collection of World War I standard long arms. Of course, the Ross belonged to the Canadian Expeditionary Force. It's called the Mark III or the Model 1910, depending on the nomenclature you want to use. Beautiful .303 caliber, straight pull, bolt action rifle.
As the 1890s develop, the Canadians, they talk about licensing production, they talk about buying arms outright, and the British aren't all that concerned with answering Canada's requests. And now, that's because the British do have a few things that they're concerned about. First, they have to re-equip their entire military with this new Lee-Enfield system. Then they've got the Boer War, and they're concerned with keeping their mainline troops equipped with this latest evolution of infantry fighting rifle. And so as a result, the Canadians aren't a high priority. Well, the Canadians decide, you know what? We're claiming our own identity. We're becoming our own distinct nation. We ought to have our own distinct military equipment. And so they explore an alternative, and that alternative is coming up with their own military rifle based on a Canadian design, a domestic design. And that design that they eventually settled on was the one developed by Sir Charles Ross.
Sir Charles Ross was an interesting character. Scottish. He eventually became the 9th Baronet of Balnagown, if that's the proper pronunciation. He was also an inventor, firearms enthusiast, and apparently one of the most irascible characters ever to come out of Scotland, and that's saying a lot, believe me. And also one of the crankiest and most difficult firearms inventors to deal with. But that being said, he invented a very, very interesting rifle. It was a straight pull. He came up with several different versions of it. It was used initially for sporting purposes, but he was always interested in trying to get government contracts. They went through a number of different incarnations of the gun. Again, it worked well enough on the sporting field. However, one of the early incarnations of the gun, they had a problem with one of the bolts exploding and hurting one of the shooters. And there were a couple of other bits and pieces of problems with them. Consequently, the gun kind of got a bad name. When they eventually came out with the final one, the Mark III or the Model 1910, which was eventually adopted by the Canadian military, the gun had been considerably improved.
The Ross rifle really started off as a sporting arm. Sir Charles Ross was an avid hunter, both in Canada and back in the United Kingdom. And he took the basic principles of the Mannlicher straight pull, made his own modifications. And it turns out they were very accurate rifles. The early Rosses were used by Canadians for hunting and for target shooting. But there were some problems with the early Ross rifles, meaning that they could be improperly assembled, their bolts. And, you know, with a straight pull, you always want to make sure it's completely locked, because if it's not, it's going to come back.
If one reads the history of the rifle, by the time it gets to 1910 and the Mark III comes, well, they've got a whole different rifle than they started with. It had done away with some of the perceived shortcomings of the Ross before. It didn't have a dump lever on it. Now it had a magazine cutoff that worked better, had a safety that worked better, and most importantly, it moved the sight back onto the receiver bridge. And this sight was made for a long-range shooter. And then they went to France. And when the first Canadian contingents got to France in 1915, trench warfare was already the name of the game in the Western Front. And where the British and Canadians were, it's just nothing but mud. And in that mud, the Canadians take the Ross rifle. The Ross rifle was very finely machined, and the mud just jammed them up.
Consequently, after a certain period of time, it was decided that the Ross, as nice a gun as it is, and as interesting a gun as it is, we're probably better off having a piece that our troops have a little more confidence in. Consequently, they were retired, and all Canadian troops were issued with a Mark III Enfield SMLE.